Hello, namaste. I am continuing to read from my new book, Shri Vidya and Navavarana Puja. We were talking last time about how Tantra is a very difficult subject to understand because it's all about mystical things. It's about spiritual things, spiritual beings, spiritual energies. And so it's very difficult. It's not an intellectual study. It's an experiential study that the sages have understood. It used to be a very mystical, hidden, secretive sort of practice that now is, we can read about it online. We can read about it in books. And so it leads to people thinking about it and possibly misunderstanding the subject matter even more. So we'll continue from my preface to the book. Modern culture, which has all been influenced to some extent by the materialism of the Western world, has certain thoughts about gender. In recent history, women have not been allowed many of the same rights in society that men have. There's a lot of desire to empower women today. And it's very true. In recent history, women were not able to do much without a man. They would have to be with their father or they'd have to be married, because in many places in the world they couldn't inherit property. They couldn't live on their own. They couldn't vote. Even at the time men were given the right to vote in many places, the women still could not vote. So the modern feminist philosophy has certain conceptions of femininity and how women should be treated and behave in society. These notions have been influenced by Christian morality and by modern secular humanist thought. Tantra has a very different view of femininity. This view is based upon the direct perception of the tantric sages, of the feminine and masculine forces in every human body, and these forces in nature also. Tantra aims to empower women and men by helping them to live in accordance with the forces of nature. Tantra has always advocated for women's rights and women's liberation. The views and practices of Tantra are different from the practices of modern feminism. Many people think that they see things clearly and that their view reveals the only right way to see or do things. They are very intolerant of different customs. They claim that any culture which views or does things a little bit differently is backwards and immoral. But we must understand that morality shifts along with the awarenesses, customs, beliefs, and needs of society. There is no universal moral right or wrong in this regard, because the needs of people change along with the customs of society. What is right today may not be right tomorrow. What is right for one culture may not be right for another. It is necessary to develop a broader view to understand such things. The scientifically minded call the tantric ways superstitious and old-fashioned because they are based upon a knowledge of the subtle elements of creation. They think that modern science and education has provided them a deeper understanding. But science is not infallible, and it certainly does not hold the complete truth. So-called scientifically minded people often discount spiritual things simply because they have yet to experience them. Just because a person has not seen something does not mean that it does not exist or that it cannot affect them. A person who does not believe in fire will get burned nonetheless. A person who does not believe in toxic radiation may be poisoned through exposure, even though they cannot see it. Tantra is a deeply mystical tradition which is based upon awareness of subtle spiritual forces in nature and their connection to the soul and body. It is a powerful technique for empowering sincere seekers to gain a direct perception of truth beyond. But many will discount the tradition already. They are too caught by the limiting views they have experienced and the beliefs which have been formed in their minds. They cannot transcend these in this lifetime because they do not have the grace to seek something greater than the current experience. The Orthodox Hindu traditions have come to many false conclusions about Tantra also. Many people fear the Tantric tradition as either a celebration of debauchery or a path of harming others for personal gains. The bizarre and taboo-seeming practices of certain tantrics, like the Aghoris who live in cremation grounds and carry human skulls as begging bowls from which to eat, has increased people's fear of the tradition. Tantrics are viewed as potentially powerful black magicians, eager to curse anyone who has slighted them. People think they can hire tantric siddhas to curse or kill their enemies through some occult power they possess. Either this or they expect that tantrics are part of some cult of drug addicts actively seeking to enslave women for the fulfillment of their perverse sexual urges. The view of Tantra has become muddied with these sorts of connotations. So the Orthodox shy away from the word Tantra, though their spiritual practices are tantric in origin. They hold to an unyielding and unchanging notion of propriety. Certain practices are accepted and others are prohibited. The Orthodox tradition is blindly followed by many, and it is not questioned. Many who have not experienced the fruits of tantric practice are writing and teaching on the subject. They condemn certain practices and advocate for others as their minds have been able to understand. Many people hold firmly to their beliefs because devoid of any true experience. It is a matter of faith. Many have become extremely intolerant in upholding their beliefs, the beliefs of their faith. For such people, any discussion of matters of faith which is not in line with the status quo for them may be very upsetting. It is important to understand how Tantra got such a reputation. Before British colonial rule in India, there was a very different idea of what Tantra was. When the British invaded India, they wanted to convert the Indian people to their Christian faith. They felt that the indigenous cultures of India were uncivilized and barbaric, and that their Christian ways were inherently better. One major way in which the British attempted to wipe out the dharmic traditions was by sending scholars to translate the Vedic texts. These sacred texts were most often passed down from guru to student as a part of an oral tradition. In general, these scriptures were inaccessible to common people. Written texts were uncommon and translations were generally unavailable. Before this time, the teachings of Tantra were carefully passed down from guru to student, and they were not well known. The translation of the scriptures from the perspective of the Christian missionaries was a clever attempt to defile the dharmic traditions. One of the earliest translators of the Vedas was Max Mueller, who wrote, quote, "The translation of the Veda will hereafter tell to a great extent on the fate of India and on the growth of millions of souls in that country. It is the root of their religion, and to show them what the root is, I feel sure, is the only way of uprooting all that has sprung from it during the last 3,000 years." Today, Max Mueller is viewed as one of the pioneers of the Western academic tradition of Indiology. Mueller was one of various European scholars sent by the crown to defame the Hindu tradition. They translated the major texts with an intention of making the tradition look bad. Max Mueller was of the belief that a reform was needed for the Hindu faith in order to bring it into alignment with the superior views and traditions of the Christian world. Obscure texts were selected for their potential to cause misunderstanding of the traditions. These texts were translated and given much attention. The Dharma Shastras, for example, were highlighted from the ancient Vedic tradition. These texts were used to reinforce thoughts that Hindu culture was uncivilized and discriminated against women and people of low birth. These texts were never major texts, and very little of the Hindu practice draws from them. Before Muslim and British rule in India, the class system was not a major consideration or aspect of Indian society. Excuse me. The British government in particular sought to implement a distinction of Indian people based upon caste in order to more easily subjugate the people and to encourage a more enlightened way of living, similar to the feudal system of England at the time. It was also claimed that women were oppressed because the cultural practices were somewhat different than those of Europe. This tendency continues today, with many Westerners feeling that India is oppressive to women because trending fashions are more modest than in Western countries. Things have changed a great deal from the times when the British invaders of India accused India of misogyny due to many women going around topless. In these times, they insisted that Indian women should wear more clothing in order to be decent like the Europeans. The outer criticisms have changed, but the intention remains the same. It is to make an indigenous culture to feel bad for being different and to promote the Western culture and the Christian sense of decency as superior. There are US-based organizations for women's rights today which claim India is the least safe country on earth for women. Despite America's higher rates of rape and violence against women, these claims are justified because fashions are different and because the traditional role of women in Indian society is somewhat different. Indian society affords great respect to women and honors the feminine in many ways Western culture does not. There is a difference of perspective here. Indian society is based around the spiritual views of the Vedas and Tantras. Western society is based upon the views of Christianity and secular humanism. Excuse me. Of the tantric text, the Mahanirvana Tantra was singled out by the evangelist translators as an exemplary work. This text was extremely obscure in India. Today, it is quite difficult to find any Hindu lineages following the practices laid out by this text. But there is more scholarly attention given to this work in the West than perhaps any other tantric text. It is widely lauded by Western scholars as the most important text of the tantric tradition. This is because the text focuses a great deal upon the heterodox practices of Tantra, which today have become inextricably associated with the tantric tradition as a whole due to the work of these clever dissemblers. Very few of the tantras discussed practices relating to wine consumption, meat eating, sexual practices, or frequenting cremation grounds. But those texts that did were intentionally put forward in order to defame the tradition. They were written about in derogatory ways, even within the select few texts which mention such heterodox practices. These subjects were not a major focus of practice. But due to the disproportionate attention given to such passages, today many think Tantra is inextricably connected to such unorthodox practices. This is, in reality, only a very tiny portion of the vast tantric tradition. Unfortunately, for many Hindu people, this was the first glimpse they got of the sacred texts of their tradition. From these early English translations, many translations were prepared in the various native Indian languages, all based upon the skewed translations of the Christian missionaries. Looking at the state of things today, it seems the translators were extremely successful in their efforts to put down the Hindu tradition. Since that time, much misunderstanding has crept into the views of Hindu people about their own faith. One popular misconception is that Hinduism is a polytheism. This idea has been repeated so often that many people have begun to take its validity for granted. But this statement has no basis in the Hindu texts, nor in the belief or practice of Hindu people. There are four major denominations today within Hinduism: Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Shaktism, and Smartism. Each of these four is monotheistic in its view of God. Some schools are dualist and others are monistic, but none is polytheistic. The notion of polytheism was one which was successfully used by the Christian missionaries to defame the indigenous pre-Christian traditions of Europe. These traditions were cast as barbaric and pagan, and they were effectively swept from the earth. The concept of monotheism has been important for those traditions which aim to wipe out other faiths and convert the world to their own ways. If it can be claimed that there is only one God, it can be claimed that this God is best. In this case, it is possible to claim that others are wrong or following a false God. God is beyond words and beyond comprehension. Names cannot accurately describe the Supreme. Many different names have been used by the enlightened sages, saints, and prophets around the world. The Vedic tradition has upheld the idea that truth is one, paths are many. The light of one faith is not diminished by the light of another. No tradition has an exclusive claim to what is infinite. Many practices, beliefs, customs, and traditions can be equally powerful to inspire people toward divine realization, but some insecure and fanatic faiths and societies have felt a need to convert everyone in the world to their beliefs and customs. Today, many Western Indiologists look down upon the Hindu traditions that they study and teach about. One professor of Sanskrit I know, who is a sincere devotee of Lord Krishna, has pointed out that within Western circles of Indiology, those who actually practice the Hindu tradition are not welcome. Their perspective and interpretations are viewed skeptically by the majority of scholars. This is not the case for other religions like Buddhism and Islam. In the circles of Western intellectuals, in these cases, the perspective of practitioners of those traditions is valued greatly. None of the major religions have such a stigma in the academic circles as does the Hindu faith. This is because the scholarship was founded upon an intention to make the tradition look bad in order to convert the Hindu people to Christianity. Scholarship on other subjects always tends to value the insight of practitioners. A music theory class proudly incorporates the insight of composers, musicians, and conductors. The perspective of such experts in the field of music is regarded highly for its practical understanding. Medical texts incorporate the discoveries of practicing physicians. Legal texts quote the lawyers and cases which have determined how the laws are interpreted. For every subject, the experience of experts in the field of practice is not only considered but regarded as most useful in the understanding of the subject. Yet in the case of Indiology, the perspective of Indians and that of people practicing the Hindu traditions is disregarded. This is a major imbalance set into motion by the early attempts of the scholars to demonize Indian culture and the Hindu traditions. Many of the myths created by Mueller and the other early translators to distort public perception of the tradition persist today. There are many inaccurate and derogatory portrayals of Hinduism and Hindu people in the textbooks. In the state of California, the courts ruled that certain inaccuracies and negative portrayals of Hinduism must be removed from college textbooks. This happened in the very liberal state of California. In many more conservative regions, these defamatory statements remain in the textbooks. These statements are expected by many naive students to be an unbiased and fact-based presentation of the subject. Many students come away from their study of Hinduism with a bad taste for the tradition. The West has embraced many of the spiritual traditions and technologies of India, but there remains a tendency to put down the Hindu traditions. There are many Western yoga teachers teaching about asana, pranayama, meditations, mantras, chakras, and I have seen many such teachers practicing and teaching these Hindu traditions. Then they say bad things about Hinduism. Many such teachers keep images of the Buddha in their yoga studios instead of associated Hindu deities. Unfortunately, many Indian Hindus also blindly follow what they have been taught about Hinduism, and texts are not often much better in India. The interpretations of the Vedas of the Christian missionaries are given much credence. The translations of the Vedas prepared by saintly Hindus are regarded with great skepticism. Few will debate the meaning of the translations of Max Mueller and the other Indiologists. Almost all these extant translations of the Hindu texts are based upon these translations. Many argue against the insights of mystics like Sri Aurobindo or Dayananda Saraswati. These native Indians were writing from their own experience about their own tradition, but their writings are dismissed by most. Sri Aurobindo in particular produced translations of portions of the Vedas with a vastly different interpretation from the work of the Christian missionaries. According to Sri Aurobindo, the word Ashva in Vedas, which is commonly translated as horse, is rightly understood to mean energy. This interpretation creates a vast difference for certain rituals like the Ashwamedha, which is commonly understood as the sacrificial killing of a horse. Many Orthodox people have trouble even imagining this possibility due to the deep-seated beliefs they hold about the Vedic tradition, which were initiated when the meaning of the Vedas was first presented by those intent upon stirring up misunderstanding and denigrating the tradition. It is likely hard for anyone to know with certainty what spiritual practice actually looked like in Vedic times. It was always necessary to have a guru to explain the scriptures and to fill in gaps in the teachings. Today, the Vedic tradition is no longer in practice, yet access to the knowledge of Vedas has been kept alive by modern tantric traditions. People feel Tantra is obscure and esoteric, and that it involves many dark practices. The whole of modern Hinduism is actually tantric in origins, however. Every deity we worship is tantric, not Vedic. They come from tantras, Puranas, Agamas, different texts like this, not directly from Vedas. The imagery, dhyana shlokams, meditation verses, all this comes from the later texts. The Vedic tradition was more complex and mystical. It was created for people living in the Vedic times. In the current age of Kali Yuga, it is no longer possible for people to grasp the complex Vedic traditions. In earlier times, people were more intelligent, they lived longer, and they were more spiritual. They could easily memorize huge amounts of hymns required for the elaborate Vedic system of worship. The abundance of resources required for the Vedic rituals were easy to acquire because the kings supported the Vedic rituals. Now, the governments generally do not support religious practice. Due to their greater awareness of spiritual forces, the people in Vedic times could easily connect with the divine through the forces of nature. The Vedic gods were natural forces like Vayu, the wind, Agni, fire, Surya, the sun, Ratri, the night, Usha, the dawn, Rudra, destruction, and Soma, which is a plant. People could see the divine presence in these forces of nature, and so naturally communed with God in this form. Now people are more bound to their human bodies and minds. They do not see the divine in nature around them. How does a person bound to the mind and senses speak to the wind or the fire? Because the people were having trouble to accomplish the complex Vedic rituals and difficulty to connect with the devas through the Vedic modes of worship, the sages revealed a more modern, tantric system in order to preserve the essence of Vedas. Rudra became Shiva, Brahmanaspati became Ganapati, Devi became Lalita Tripura Sundari. Each of these more abstract forms of God took on an anthropomorphic form, not because the divine beings look like human beings, but to help embodied souls bound by their human bodies to approach these divine beings. People can meditate on God in a familiar human form in order to develop a relationship. The devas can appear in this familiar human form and speak to a person in the language they understand. When people meditate on the anthropomorphic, the human form of the deities, they begin to transcend their human bodies and minds. These modern deities can be invoked by the ancient Vedic mantras, and simpler mantras were also revealed, which are easier to learn. In this way, the sages made the Vedic mantras and deities relevant to modern people who are lacking in intelligence and spirituality compared to the people in the Vedic times. In this way, they kept the ancient tradition alive. The complex and unfathomable Vedic rituals were replaced with simpler practices which are more easily understood. In puja, we invite God to come into our home and then offer a series of different offerings just as we would to a respected guest visiting the home. This is simplistic. It can be easily understood, and even by very stupid people. This is a practice which can be accomplished in this age. I'll stop here in the reading for now, and we'll discuss a little bit. Vedic times, it was a different yuga, we have to remember. It was not Kali Yuga. The lifespan of people, all the scriptures tell us, the lifespan of people has become less. The intelligence of people has become less. The spirituality of people has become less. They've become more materialistic. And so the sages revealed this new tantric tradition, and most of the practices come from these tantric texts. The tantras, the agamas, and the Puranas give us the modern pujas, and even the modern homa rituals we perform at home in the temples. They're based upon the Vedic traditions, but they're different. They're simplified. In Vedic times, they didn't build temples. They would build a yagyashala, arena for the fire ceremony, and after the ceremony was completed, the final offering, they would burn the structure that they had built. They didn't have these temples constructed that we do now. This is modern tradition. This is tantric tradition. So we have to be careful. Perspective changes through time. We're talking about why the tantric tradition is very much misunderstood in these days now. But perspective changes, morality changes. Just like we said in the reading, that when the Christian missionaries came to India, they were shaming Hindu women for going around without a blouse. They wore sari without a blouse in those days. In places like Kerala in particular, they would go around completely topless. It was very warm. And the Christian people said, this is indecent. Now, the Western morality has changed. A couple of hundreds of years later, 300 years later or so, the Western women are wearing less clothing, and they're saying that the Indian society represses women by forcing them to wear too many clothing. And so the perspective has changed. Morality changes necessarily. The rights of women have changed, and the role of women in society has changed. Women were not working jobs in earlier times. In India, in the West, now they work. Now they have to get paid so they can own property. They couldn't own property before. It makes sense that they can own property. They talk about even the age of consent for marriage, for sex, for these kind of things. This has changed. At the time, 250 years ago, when America was founded as a country, the age of consent was 12 or 14, as it was in British law. Age of marriage, without a parent signing off saying this is okay. But people got married earlier in those days. People would get married around 18, 20 years old. Now, many people, they go to university first. They may not get married till they get established in their job at the age of 26 or 30. People are living longer also because the sanitation has improved, the healthcare has improved. So the life expectancy in those days was less, so it made sense. People would get married younger. Now people get married older, but we think, a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's evil. That people would let a 12-year-old get married. How dare they? But who are we to judge? They lived a lot less years in those days. They had to get started raising their family. There's a good chance they may lose one of the parents, even getting married at a quite young age. Who are we to judge? Who are we to condemn? How do we know what's right? How do we set that age of consent? Even in the U.S. today, in my state of Virginia, the age of consent, I think, is 18 years old. If you go just a few miles south to the state of North Carolina, age of consent is 16, I believe. How do we set that age? And is it the same? It's not the same for every person, right? Some people, they mature more quickly. Typically, they say the women mature more quickly, so they're not as stupid going around doing crazy things as children as the boys. The boys will be fighting and playing, and the girls grow up more quickly into a mature human being who could talk to you and have a conversation and answer a question reasonably. The boys will be just having fun, talking back to you. But not every boy matures at the same age. Not every girl matures at the same age. So it's very difficult. How do we as a society say that every 18-year-old person is competent to make a decision? If a person has a mental illness, a mental disability, they may not be as competent. We can't just say every 18-year-old is competent to make a decision. That's why they take away the right of people to vote who have committed a felony, a crime. They say you may not be competent to make this decision. How can we say every 18-year-old? And how can we say a 12-year-old is not able to, a 16-year-old is not able to? Depends upon the individual. How do we set a universal standard for laws? We have to. So we have to be very careful looking at these teachings of Tantra, which may go against some of our modern sensibilities. And the ways of Western materialism have started to influence the thinking of all the world. Throughout the world, people want to dress like the Hollywood people. America and the movies of America, the Hollywood, the media of America has influenced the whole world. I've kept you for a while today in this video. I promise I'll stop very soon, but I want to point out that I grew up in the state of Virginia, where a lot of people are talking like this. The traditional accent of my area of Virginia is a little like this. But I don't talk like this. I talk just like the Hollywood actors. I talk in this California accent that all over the US, in the big cities, people are talking in this accent, which started in Hollywood and it's been made popular by the actors and actresses. We're copying the culture and the tradition that we see on the big screen in Hollywood, Bollywood. It's all it influences the whole world. And so people in India, people in China, people in Japan are starting to dress like people in America and copy that culture for better or for worse. And they're copying some of the thoughts of the Western materialism and the humanist, the secular humanism philosophy that doesn't really have a place for God, doesn't have a place for mystical experiences, doesn't have a place for knowledge of the subtle energies in the body, the energy of the divine masculine on the right side of the body connected to the Pingala Nadi, and the divine feminine on the left side of the body connected to the Ida Nadi. So we'll talk more about these nadis and these energies within the body, I think, next time. We'll see how far we get in the reading. All right. Om Kaila Hrim Hasakahala Hrim Sakala Hrim Om Lalitambikaye Namaha.